Hey, Latin 2. It is a few days out when I'm filming this from when you actually need to know it, but let's go ahead and get this done. And if you're not ready to watch this yet, you can put this off until we're reading chapter 33. But if you are ready to watch it, if you want to know the truth behind something that I did not address in the last video, well, then maybe you should just go ahead and watch this video on perfect passive participles. See, in the last video that I made for you guys in Latin 2, excuse me, in the last video that I made for you guys in Latin 2, I talked about perfect passive verbs. And I was showing you guys how the perfect passive verb formed in Latin is actually 2 words long. Instead of being just a stem and an ending, the stem was actually an adjective, a word in its own right, that had, its own stem plus an adjective ending, and then you add a form of sum to it, but not directly to it. Like it sits apart as a separate word, but the 2 words work together to form one verb, right? One finite verb. But we didn't really talk about what's going on with that adjective, all right? Because, clearly it's important. This adjective is one of our 4 principal parts, right? We've got a first-person verb, an infinitive, another first-person verb, and an adjective. And there's a name for this kind of adjective. It's not simply an adjective. This is a participle, all right? Now, I know some of you guys are familiar with the word participle already, and you're probably comfortable with that. Some of you may not be. But here's the thing that you need to know about participles if you don't already know it. A participle is a verbal adjective. That's what it is. It's when you make an adjective out of a verb. And that is a simple, direct fact you can take to the bank. If somebody says, what is a participle? You can say, it's a verbal adjective. You take a verb, you use it to describe something rather than actually acting as a verb, and then it's a participle. And I know from my experience of, teaching a lot of students that so oftentimes I say participle and they're like, oh, you mean those words that end in ing? Well, it's not quite that simple, right? Because in English, we use ing for a lot of things. Oftentimes, we use ing as, part of a more complicated verb, right? To show ongoing motion or whatever. Sometimes an ing is stuck on the end of not a participle, but a gerund, right? Like if you say, I hate running. I know some of you guys are runners out there, broken hearts. But if I say, I hate running, running in there is a direct object. That would be a gerund. It's a verbal noun. But I could also talk about the dance, The Running Man, where running is describing man, and that is an adjective, and that would be a participle. But that's only one type of participle. That would be a present participle, and I'm actually not ready to talk about present participles yet. We'll talk about those later. It's not me. It's not that I don't want to talk about present participles, but the thing is our book is going to start using perfect passive participles in chapter 33. And we're sort of using them already just by using them to make perfect passive verbs, which begins in chapter 32. But the book isn't going to start giving you any regular practice on the present participle until like chapter 40. So we'll hold off a minute on that. And in the meantime, we're just going to focus on the perfect passive participle, because that is what amatus is. You see, if you translate amatus just as amatus, what it means is loved, like the adjective loved. And, if you're translating your sentence and you need more than just the word loved, you can also put a having been in there. It makes it sound nice and participial, having been loved. But even if you leave out the having been, loved by itself can be used to describe something. And when you do that, when you describe something as loved, you are using a perfect passive participle, okay? So in terms of it behaving like an adjective, that means it's going to decline. Now, I know when I showed you perfect passive verbs, I certainly was not showing you anything with this many endings on it. When you form them in your verb forms, you're only ever going to use the nominative, right? Amatus or amati if it's plural, or if your subject is feminine, amata, amata if it's plural, if it's neuter, amatum or amata if it's plural. And the reason that we only used those nominative forms when we were actually using these to make perfect passive verbs is because when it's a verb, the participle necessarily has to agree with the subject. The subject governs the verb. That's true whether the verb is active or passive. So it necessarily always agrees with the subject, and then you have your form of sum in there to finish it out and make it a finite verb. The thing about participles, though, is if it is not working with a form of sum, if it's truly a participle and not part of a perfect passive verb, it doesn't necessarily have to agree with the nominative. It could be describing the subject of your sentence, but it could be describing anything else in the sentence as well. Here, let me show you an example. Here's an example sentence that says, my beloved cats, or my loved cats, or my cats having been loved. There are several ways you can think of it. I'm going to use beloved, though, because I think it sounds the most natural, or honestly the cutest in English. So, my beloved cats love to play with almonds. It's actually kind of weird and cute. If you give them almonds, they'll run around with them in their mouths, they play with them. It's a lot cheaper than buying cat toys. I mean, we do buy them cat toys, but they play with the almonds. Anyway, the point here is that what I have here is I have my subject, cats, and then I have what they're doing, which is loving, and then the thing they're loving, which is to play with almonds. But I have this extra verbal idea in here too, right? And I know in this sentence I'm using a participle that's derived from the main verb, but that's neither here nor there. It's an extra verbal idea that's not the main one. And that's what you can do with the participle is you can add an extra verbal idea to your sentence with a single word, right? My cats love to play with almonds, but what kind of cats are they? They are beloved cats. They are cats who are loved. And I can pack that extra information in there just with a participle. Now, I could do that with something more extensive or, more involved. I could say, my cats who are loved, and use a relative clause. But why go to all the trouble of using a relative clause if I can do it with just a single word participle? Well, I don't have to, right? I could have written a whole relative clause in there, but I can accomplish the same information with just a participle. But like I said, the participle doesn't have to agree with the subject. In this sentence, it did. My cats are the subject, and amati has a nominative plural ending. But it didn't have to, right? I could also say, my cats love to play with beloved almonds. Same words, same order even, but you'll notice that I've got a different ending on beloved. Now it is ablative plural, so it agrees with the almonds. My cats love to play with the beloved almonds, right? Because it really can't agree with everything. Now, some of you are probably having a low-key panic attack. Hopefully it's low-key. I mean, I'm sure some of you are fine with this. Because I know some of you are thinking I do not want another thing to think about. I do not want another form to learn. Well, don't panic too much because for one, if I go back and, just kind of zoom out on these tables, which by the way, if you want to write this down, you'll need to pause. I'm not going to hold on this very long, but you will notice that these tables have first and second declension endings. That's one of the great things about perfect passive participles is the endings that come on them are endings that we already know really well from first and second declension adjectives in Latin 1. If you can recognize the endings that go on simple words like boy and girl and farm and room, then you're not going to have any trouble recognizing the case endings themselves, okay? But in addition to that, they're also easier to recognize than you might imagine when you get used to seeing them, in part because nearly all perfect passive participles have a stem that ends in a T right before its case ending, right? So, you saw, the principal parts of amo amare over there, and the participle is amatus. That T is not random or unique or special. The vast majority of these participles have a T at the end of their stem. Vexo turns into vexatus, ago turns into actus, finio turns into finitus. And this is true for a huge percentage of participles. Not all of them are that way. There's also a significant number, not a majority, but still a very large number that have S instead of T. So, here's again some random examples. Mitomisus, carocasus, mordeo morsus. In fact, if you've watched a lot of my videos, you've probably seen this before because I so often use it in the examples. But yeah, if basically when you see these participles, expect it to end in a T, and then if it doesn't end in a T, expect it to end in an S. There we go. Keep dragging my finger till I get to the S. And if you were to translate these, so, vexatus would be having been annoyed or just annoyed. Actus would be having been done or just done. Finitos finitus, having been finished or just finished. And then we would have, you know, sent, felled, bitten, right? The only possibility you might have other than T or S, and this is super rare, like honestly, you're not going to see this Latin too, but it's theoretically possible at some point in your life. You might see a participle where the stem ends in X, all right? And this is not a verb that you guys have seen before. I think the Latin 4 kids have seen this one, but in Latin 2 you have not. Nitor, which has some other principal parts, and the fourth one is nixus. This does happen every rare once in a while where you'll have an X instead of a T or an S. But this is so rare as to not need to worry about it. Just, for future reference, if you're going to be doing this for a while, that's a thing that could happen, but it probably won't. All right? And even then, with that particular verb, the dictionary actually lists nixus and I think also Nikitas. I think there's like two different spellings. So like even with that one, you might not see it. So expect it to end in T or if not TS. Most of them end in T. Nearly every other one ends in S. All right? And you'll even recognize this in words in English. A lot of words that we have in English that end in ATOR or ATION are derived from the fourth principal part of a word. So, come at me in the comments if you want to and start throwing me example words, and I can probably point which Latin verb it comes from, that it is essentially the fourth principal part of. But one other thing I think I want to point out before we leave is that you can have a bunch of these in a sentence. Now, you probably aren't going to have a sentence that has as many as this, but you could. That's one of the interesting things about participles. As an adjective, you can pack as many into a sentence as you want, and you can take a sentence and add a lot of verbal components to it without adding a lot of weird subordinate clauses. Now, again, this kind of sentence is unlikely. I don't typically see sentences with this many participles, but I don't never see sentences with this many participles. So what that says in full is, my annoyed cats asked me, tired is describing me, my annoyed cats asked tired me to remove their beloved almonds from the closed room. And so I just took every single noun in there and described it with the participle, which is totally something you can do. Again, it doesn't matter what case the noun is in, as long as you put the participle in the same case, then it agrees by the same rules of all noun-adjective agreement. And I'm basically just adding a lot of information to the sentence by giving you extra verbal ideas without having to add a whole lot of extra verbs. I know I have technically 2 verbs in here instead of 1, but still I have 2 verbs in here and I have 6 verbal ideas. So you learn a lot about, what's going on with the cats, right? You learn that the cats are annoyed, presumably, by the situation of their almonds being locked away from them. You know that I am tired. Is that relevant to the rest of the sentence? Not particularly, but it's something that you know about me. You know that they love those almonds, right? Because they just, they're fun to play with, I guess. And you know that they need to be rescued or removed from a room that is closed, which of course is why the cats are annoyed, because they can't get to the almonds because the room is closed. And you can add all that information in without having to, write 6 separate sentences. Because that would be the alternative here, is just having to write longer or more sentences. The cats were annoyed because the almonds, which they love, are in a room that is closed, that they needed to be opened by me who is tired, right? I mean, that sounds like trash. And you can accomplish that way more efficiently by just putting in these descriptive participles. So there you go. There's a real quick rundown of participles. You're probably going to want some more explanation or more practice or questions answered, but that's what the homework is for. So, at me in the comments or, just start talking to me about your homework. And yeah, we'll deeply dive into the world of verbal adjectives. Not just now, but later on when we deal with the other verbal adjectives that also exist in this weird and ancient language. All right. Bye, everybody.